Hello, welcome back. My name is Sarah Turner, and I'll be your trainer for this training session, where we will be covering capacity expansion modeling. When we last left off, we had just finished creating our first three technologies in Engage and simulated a one-year run of a solar photovoltaic or PV technology meeting the electrical demands of a hospital. We saw that Engage built exactly what we modeled for, which was the supply technology of a 1 megawatt solar farm. We saw that there was consistent unmet demand, indicating that the 1 megawatt solar technology was not enough to meet the daily peaks of the hospital. And we saw that the annual cost of running the system was approximately $242,000. Today, we will be exploring how we can cost optimally meet the hospital's remaining demand using a capacity expansion modeling approach. You might be asking yourself, though, what is capacity expansion modeling? Capacity expansion is a form of modeling that simulates investment into new generation and transmission capacity, given assumptions about future electricity demand, fuel prices, technology cost and performance, as well as policy and regulation. So far in Engage, we have modeled generation and transmission technologies as existing assets in order to understand their expenditures in 1 year. Capacity expansion modeling, however, is different from traditional production cost modeling in that the model is given the option to choose new resources to build, optimizing around a specific variable. While this variable can depend on the modeling tool, most capacity expansion models, including Engage, tend to formulate their optimizations around cost, identifying the least cost pathway to meet demand, both on an investment and operational basis. Capacity expansion models can be great when trying to answer questions like what operational and energy cost savings could be anticipated by transitioning from a decentralized energy portfolio to a centralized one? How does the cost optimal system vary with constraints on emissions, land use, and economic development goals? And what are the high-level cost impacts of alternative power sector policies? Capacity expansion models, though, have their own limitations. One being that they are not operational models. What do we mean by that? It means that Engage can be operationally unrealistic in that it has perfect foresight when optimizing an energy portfolio, which is different from grid operators in real life who rely on historical trends, real-time forecasts, and system conditions. While these points of reference are incredibly helpful, they cannot always help grid operators predict how they'll need to scale up their capacity and operate their assets in order to meet demand. For example, Engage might see that it will need to keep batteries charged when it is sunny in earlier days to meet demand later when it will be cloudy, and solar won't be able to produce as much electricity. Even though this would be the cost optimal strategy, Engage would likely still be sizing and discharging the batteries in operationally unrealistic ways, as grid planners cannot always know or predict when demand suddenly changes or when a power asset will be out of service. This is why grid operators may oversize their batteries or use a reserve margin to prepare for operating their grid under worse circumstances. Indeed, testing how power assets operate under multiple scenarios is often the core purpose of operational models like cost production models. And unlike capacity expansion models, which capacity expansion models are focused on the planning of new or additional assets to the grid. Currently, Calliope does have the feature to run a model in operation mode that can simulate the limited foresight we just mentioned. This is, however, not an existing feature in Engage, but we're hoping to include it in future sessions. Another limitation to be aware of, not just in capacity expansion modeling, but all energy system modeling, is that some models represent power plants as one aggregate generator, even though power plants are commonly made up of multiple individual generators. It is these generators that together make up the total power capacity of the plant, and each generator potentially has its own operational parameters. While Engage can certainly be used to model each one of these generators individually, it can quickly become unmanageable, as it can lead to models that are too complex to solve in a reasonable time frame, especially for large-scale models. Aggregating individual generators into one power plant can address this, but it can also lead to the model potentially oversimplifying important operational parameters, such as the flexibility of the plant that operators have, such as, being able to run one or more generators that, let's say, have different fuel efficiencies. Since the operational parameters of a power plant have to be averaged across its generators in an aggregate treatment, Engage may overvalue or undervalue a power plant in a sample dispatch, which can lead to suboptimal investment decisions. These are just some examples of limitations to capacity expansion modeling, which is why it is always important to verify Engage's results, potentially through other tools, and think critically about the model's outputs. Nevertheless, capacity expansion models can be used to guide valuable insights into energy sector planning questions, such as identifying competitive technologies. Now that we know a bit more about capacity expansion, it's time to build our first two capacity expansion technologies in Engage. These two technologies will involve the last two technology archetypes that we weren't able to cover in our last training session, the storage archetype and the conversion archetype. A storage archetype is a technology that can take carriers in and store them until later time intervals when the carriers can be dispatched back to the system. Storage archetypes are useful for representing a number of real-world technologies like electric batteries and electrochemical storage, potential or kinetic energy storage, such as water in a dam at a specific height, and the storage for fuels like natural gas and diesel. Storage technologies are similar to supply technologies in that they can supply a carrier to a system when there's demand. But unlike supply, storage can only supply as much carriers as it is given to store. In other words, a storage technology can never create a new carrier, which is why a supply technology is always necessary to model the storage of any carrier. For our model, we will create a 4-hour lithium-ion battery that can store any additional electricity from our solar panels when production is high. Storage technologies and Engage come with a variety of different parameters that enable modelers to reflect on real-world operation constraints, or rather, they can reflect real-world operational constraints, such as the storage duration of the technology. The storage duration is a necessary field that should be specified for every storage technology using the C rate parameter. The C stands for the maximum capacity of the storage technology, which means that the C rate overall describes the rate at which a storage technology can be discharged relative to its maximum capacity. Let's look at some examples. If we wanted to, let's say, model a 2-hour battery, we would want to specify that the C rate is 50% per hour. Think about it. If a battery can only discharge for 2 hours, then that would mean that the battery's maximum storage capacity would be gone after 2 hours, which means at 1 hour, half of that storage capacity is already gone. If the storage technology, however, was a 4-hour battery, that would mean that 25% of its maximum storage capacity would be gone in an hour. We'll go ahead and populate this to our storage technology as seen on this screen. This formulation might be confusing for modelers who are not used to configuring storage technologies. But it makes more sense once you realize that the denominator of your C rate should always represent the hour duration you are wishing to model, whether that be a 6-hour battery or a 10-hour battery. The second parameter you're required to populate for a storage technology is its storage capacity. Unlike a supply technology's capacity, which represents the rate at which the technology can produce a carrier, the storage capacity represents the total amount of carrier the technology can store. This is why we use kilowatts to describe a solar technology's power, since it is the rate of electricity it can produce. But we would use kilowatt hours to represent our battery storage capacity. For now, we will specify a really large number in our model for the battery's maximum storage capacity that could easily serve the hospital's load if needed. So far, we have been modeling technologies as fixed assets, where Engage is not given the choice to build a new resource. But since we are wanting to model a battery as a capacity expansion technology, where Engage is given the choice, we would want to configure 3 specific parameters to signal to Engage that this is a capacity expansion technology. To make any technology a capacity expansion technology, the first thing we would need to enable is the technology's parameter as a maximum function. What do we mean by this? Well, for our battery, the technology's primary function would be to store electricity. So, we would want to constrain the technology's maximum storage capacity parameter instead of its storage capacity parameter. This tells Engage that it not only has the choice to build the battery, but that it can also choose how much storage capacity to build, usually based on what's cost optimal. We would call this a linear capacity expansion technology, since Engage can linearly expand the technology storage capacity to the cost optimal point, and that is down to the kilowatt hour. This is in contrast to a unit capacity expansion technology, which we will describe in more detail when we develop our conversion technology. You'll notice that even the C rate has a maximum parameter, meaning that the storage duration could also be capacity expanded to meet the optimal discharge rate for demand. The only problem with this approach is that it assumes that the cost of storage is also linear. This is not the case for many storage systems, where usually the bigger they are and the more they store, the more expensive the technology can get on a kilowatt basis. This is why in Engage, even though storage duration can be capacity expanded, we at NREL often make new technologies to represent the monetary constraints of a technology while fixing the duration. The second and third parameters Engage requires to be filled out for a capacity expansion technology is its interest rate and its lifetime and amortization period, which we will populate as 5% and 20 years respectively. Why does Engage require these parameters? Mainly because of how the model treats cash flows. When Engage cost optimizes a run's dispatch, Engage does this according to the system's total costs, both fixed and operating, which are processed on an annualized basis. What does this mean? Well, let's go back to our solar system example. In our previous training session, we discussed how Engage could represent the fixed cost of a 2 million solar system through its production capacity cost parameter, where every kilowatt of the 1 megawatt solar system equates to $2 million. If we had opted for this cost representation and configured the solar system as a capacity expansion technology, Engage would not necessarily make its decision to build the solar farm based solely on its total price tag, the $2 million. Instead, Engage would make the decision based on which technology would create the lowest cash flows for that year. For example, if we said that the solar system had a technological lifespan of, let's say, 20 years, then Engage would annualize the solar system's total cost across its technological lifespan, so that in its first year of operation, the solar system's cash flows would be a cost of $100,000. This annual cost of the system would go up to approximately $160,000 a year if, let's say, there was a 5% interest rate being paid on the solar system. Even though an in-depth exploration of energy financing is beyond the scope of this training series, you can certainly see how Engage's capacity expansion parameters can be used to model many real-world conditions that energy providers face when deciding to build new energy systems. Some examples of what the lifetime and amortization period parameter can represent include the technological lifespan of a technology, the contract period with an individual generator, or the maturity date of a loan. The interest rate, meanwhile, can represent the cost of debt on the loan, the required rate of return on an asset, or the weighted average cost of capital, also called the WACC. Again, as you start to build more technologies for capacity expansion, it is important to keep in mind last training session's modeling tips so that you are consistent in coaxing your model to represent the cash flows you desire. With these three parameters configured, the maximum storage capacity, lifetime and amortization period, and interest rate, you are ready to begin competing your storage technologies with other technologies in the model. To properly compete your technology, however, you must have some type of storage cost established. But where would you get that type of information? Thankfully, NREL already has a tool that you can use to study the costs of energy technologies and how they are projected to change over time. This tool is called the Annual Technology Baseline, or the ATB. The ATB is a populated framework that identifies technology-specific costs as they relate to performance parameters under a robust set of modeling inputs that consider potential electricity generation futures as well as financial modeling scenarios. The ATB can be a great resource to get started on modeling costs, but it is important to note that the ATB uses assumptions primarily focused within the United States market. In this way, it is always preferable to have historical cost data as it considers the local conditions that can impact your individual system. The ATB offers technology frameworks for both transportation and electricity, but today we'll be focusing on the electric sector, specifically utility scale batteries. We will be populating our cost of production capacity parameter in the model using the ATB's 2023 overnight capital costs and our annual fixed operation and maintenance cost parameter with the ATB's costs under the moderate scenario for a 4-hour battery. If you would like to learn more about how the ATB makes these financial assumptions, as well as financial modeling scenarios, you can always read about the details on the website. The final constraint we'll want to add is the one-way efficiency parameter. We will use the assumptions from the ATB for our model, which assumes a round-trip efficiency of 85%. The one-way efficiency parameter is a technological constraint that measures the loss in storing a carrier for a period of time, whether that's on the charging side or discharging side for our battery. To convert the round-trip efficiency to a one-way efficiency, all we have to do is square root the parameter. Always check your parameter units as they're saved on the right-hand side of the screen, just to make sure that they are accurate and they represent the appropriate formulation. And with that, we are ready to create our next capacity expansion technology, which will also be our last technology archetype covered, the conversion archetype. The conversion archetype technology is arguably one of the most important archetypes in Engage, as it is the only Calliope archetype that can convert one type of carrier to another. Conversion archetypes are appropriate for technologies where we would want to track the input carriers used in the production of another carrier, such as fuel for a power plant. Common conversion technology examples include combined cycle gas turbines, natural gas boilers, coal power plants, or even electric transformers if we're wanting to model voltage changes in transmission lines. Conversion archetypes are also appropriate for modeling complex technologies that, let's say, have multiple input and output carriers. Move forward a little bit. And so to model these technologies, Calliope has a separate conversion archetype called Conversion Plus, which relies on carrier ratios to define the production relationship between the input and output carriers. Conversion Plus archetypes are useful for modeling more complicated energy systems, like combining heat and power, or combined heat and power, advanced gas turbines, and air source heat pumps. While Conversion Plus will not be directly covered in this training session, you can learn more about Conversion Plus under the Calliope documentation and Engage. For now, we will focus on the standard archetype conversion technology, which involves just one carrier being converted into a different carrier. We will be using the conversion archetype to build a backup hybrid diesel generator as our second capacity expansion technology to see how it compares to a battery storage system to meet the hospital's demand. Before we can create the diesel generator, though, we first must establish a supply technology to represent the technology's access to fuel. Creating a supply technology for diesel is a straightforward process, since the only parameters you'll be populating will be the available resource and the carrier production cost parameters, which the latter represents the price of fuel. First, we must create a new carrier to represent diesel, and for simplicity, we will use the kilowatt hour to represent the measure of energy in the fuel. Then we will create the supply technology, calling it diesel supply, where its only carrier is diesel. We will assume for now that there are no restrictions on the generator's access to fuel and that there is an infinite supply by putting a large number like 10 gigawatt hours. As we know, prices for diesel are represented not by how much energy the diesel contains, but by volume, such as liters or gallons. If it costs, let's say, $3 for a gallon of diesel, how do we convert this into a kilowatt hour price? This is where the unit conversion features in Engage become really handy for us, as it can do the calculation for us. If you look at the video, and I'll play it back for you again, if you start typing diesel into the carrier production cost parameter, Engage automatically pulls up the energy density of diesel in either volume or mass. Since we'll be using gallons as our unit of reference, we will select volume. Once we have the energy density of diesel, we can convert it into a relevant price by typing $3 per gallon. You'll see on the right-hand side that Engage has automatically done the calculation for us. This is just one example of how you can use the parameter fields in Engage to do unit conversions. As you continue to work and Engage, some important tips though to keep in mind about unit conversion is to always structure inputs in compatible or equivalent units to achieve the target units for the model. Remember to also separate terms by spaces to improve the formula's readability, and to use parentheses to indicate the order of operations, as we have done in the slide. Finally, you can search for existing unit conversions pre-populated in Engage, as we demonstrated. But the Engage converter does not handle any type of currency conversions, so those calculations would have to be handled outside of the model. With our diesel supply set up, we are now ready to start building our diesel generator, which we will say is a fairly large diesel generator at 550 kilovolt amps, given the hospital's demand. First assign the input carrier as diesel, and then assign the output carrier as electricity. If you follow the instructions on the slide, you'll see you should also create a version tag and color, and then click Save. The ATB does not have any cost or performance data on diesel generators, so we will be using a combination of different publicly available resources to configure our technology. A description of those assumptions and resources have already been populated in the description box for documentation, which you can view with the publicly available version of this training module. The first parameter is the diesel generator's cost, which has an approximate retail value of $162,000 per unit. The second parameter we'll want to populate is the technology's unit production capacity. Since our diesel generator has a kilovolt ampage of 550, which is the apparent power of the generator, we would want to multiply the capacity against a power factor of, let's say, 80%, because this will represent the real power of the generator at 440 kilowatts. Notice that we are populating the unit parameters instead of the cost of production capacity parameter or the maximum production capacity parameter, because we are configuring our technology according to the unit capacity expansion method and not the linear. Expanding a technology on a unit basis means that Engage makes its decision to build a technology in terms of the production capacity of that unit. You can consider it like a block. Unlike the linear approach, which constructs the exact cost optimal production capacity, The unit capacity expansion method assesses the model discretely, determining the cost optimal number of units to serve demand. Building a unit capacity expansion technology has advantages, the primary one being that it is closer to real-world investment decisions. Rarely do energy planners know the exact production capacity needed to meet demand, as is represented in a linear capacity expansion model. Instead, energy planners may look at production capacity as units, such as whether it is worth building another power plant, under the assumption that it is better to build too much capacity than too little, as we have described with the issues of limited foresight. Unit capacity expansion approaches, however, can also have challenges. The most important one being that they can be harder for the models to solve. In a unit-based model, where each production capacity unit is treated as an individual variable, the search space for the cost optimal dispatch can be vast, especially when factoring in technological and monetary constraints. Consequently, unit-based capacity expansion models can quickly become algorithmically complex if more units are added to your model to process, which can create longer run times to the point that your model may become computationally unsolvable. To avoid this problem, we will limit the number of units needed to serve the maximum load for the hospital, which is about approximately 5 units if the individual backup diesel generator has a real power production capacity of 440 kilowatts. Otherwise, the two remaining parameters we need to turn the diesel generator into a capacity expansion technology remain the same. We will use the same interest rates and the technological lifespan of a diesel generator, which is also approximately 20 years. Since we are creating a capacity expansion technology for a diesel generator, there are a couple of additional parameters we'll need to populate to fully capture the operational constraints commonly experienced by thermal generators. The first being a minimum operating level. Many thermal generators, from natural gas to coal to biodiesel power plants, require a minimum operating load to run to avoid issues with inefficiency, instability, and if it's a fossil fuel, usually high emissions. It should be noted that this is another advantage of the unit capacity modeling approach. Since Engage treats every unit as an individual variable in its decision to build, Engage can expand unit technologies that have working minimum operating levels similar to real-world conditions where if, let's say, the technology cannot be run at let's say, less than 50% of its maximum capacity, then it gets shut down. Linear capacity expansion technologies, on the other hand, can't do this and would interpret the minimum operating level as the required minimum capacity that they should be operating at. In other words, the technology would never shut down and would always operate between the maximum and the minimum load. To avoid this hassle, minimum operating level is usually kept off in a linear capacity expansion technology to avoid creating what we could call an operating floor. The minimum operating load will depend on the specific technology, but for our diesel generator, let's say that it needs to run at least 50% of its maximum production capacity, meaning the, the backup diesel generator would need to be running at least 220 kilowatts in order to run. Otherwise, Engage will shut it off. Another parameter we'll need to populate is the maximum ramp-up rate, which tells Engage how much time a technology needs before it is able to serve its maximum production capacity. This parameter is particularly relevant for thermal generators like coal and nuclear power plants that need a lot of time to warm up before they can start producing electricity. Diesel generators, on the other hand, can ramp up pretty quickly. So we will say 100% of its maximum capacity will be ready to use within the hour. Finally, most thermal generators are not 100% efficient in converting their fuel into electricity. Most thermal generators experience some type of loss in the conversion of fuel to power, where energy is often lost in the form of heat. Diesel generators are more efficient than gasoline in this process, but still only average a fuel efficiency of about 30%. One last cost parameter we will add to our diesel generator is its operation and maintenance cost, which we will represent this time on a variable basis at 1 cent per kilowatt hour. This is as opposed to the fixed way that we were converting it before, which was per kilowatt on an annual basis. Now that we have finished configuring our two capacity expansion technologies, we are ready to rerun our model. The model building process should feel more familiar to you as we consider where we would like to place our new technologies. Follow along with the steps that we have outlined and pause the video as needed. For now, let's assign our diesel supply to a new location in Port-au-Prince, which we will call Verux. This means that we will also need to create a new transmission technology, following a copper plate model to connect the diesel supply to the diesel generator, which we will call diesel transport. And notice that the carrier is diesel, not electricity. Also note that we are specifying a maximum carrying capacity to make it a capacity expansion technology, not a fixed asset. Entering the Nodes tab, we will assign the diesel supply technology to Varux, the diesel generator to the solar farm, the battery to the hospital, and then connect the diesel supply to the hospital's location with diesel transport. Moving into the scenarios page, you will see the new nodes have been updated to our screen, and by default, they are in the off position. We will start by toggling on the backup diesel generator to meet the hospital's remaining demand. To do this, turn on all nodes, which you see is in the top, but you will want to keep one node off in the off position, and that's our 4-hour lithium-ion battery. You'll see that the runs page automatically tells you when there's been changes and that our model is now considered out of date. To refresh a run, simply click out of date and a new run will appear in the top of the queue. Looks like I accidentally logged myself off. Let me try this again. There we go. And so don't forget that when we update our nodes, you need to specify the new model configuration. It may take your model a few moments to complete the run, but once it does, you'll see a new plot produced from the run where backup diesel generators were built to satisfy the remaining unmet demand. As you can see in that top corner there of the screen, diesel generators have been built and that little unmet demand icon is gone, meaning the hospital's demand has been fully served. That was just one approach with a backup diesel generator. But now we'll try rerunning our scenario where only the lithium-ion battery is enabled. To do this, we will go back into our Scenarios tab and turn off the diesel generator and enable the battery technology node instead. Once again, we can click Out of Date under the Runs page to rerun the model. When you click on the Plots button again after the model is finished, we can see that the model decided to utilize the battery storage to meet demand. And if you click through both plots, both plots will help you understand how the technologies performed in each scenario and how they compared in terms of cost and capacity builds. We will explore going into the different modeling results in more detail during our next training session, but consider the questions on the screen as you finish configuring your models and running them. And as I said before, we will go over the answer to each one of these questions in our next training session. And so you are now armed with the basic engaged training you need to start exploring more advanced energy technologies and scenarios. In our next video, we will be covering how to model renewables and the specific parameters around those, as well as how Engage can be used on a very high level to model scenarios related to resilience and power sector modeling. If you have any questions or issues, please feel free to contact us at the email provided on the slide. Thank you again so much.